God calls us into unexpected and uncomfortable situations. We see this in our first reading with Eli and Samuel. Eli is an old man who has spent his entire life in devotion to God, waiting to hear God's voice. He has lived his life in the tent of the Lord, protecting and taking care of the Ark of the Covenant. And as his life is winding down to a close, he has taken on this young apprentice who hears God's voice calling in the night. Neither Eli nor Samuel knows how to respond to this call at first, until Eli finally wakes up, both figuratively and literally, to the reality of God's call. Similarly, in the Gospel reading, we have the calling of Philip and Nathanael. While Philip embraces the call he receives directly from Jesus, Nathanael does not know how to respond when Philip tells him that Jesus the Nazarene is the man they have been waiting for to lead them. Instead of jumping at the opportunity, Nathanael's initial reaction is, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" It is only later, after Jesus himself calls him, that Nathanael embraces this call to follow. Tomorrow we celebrate the birth of Martin Luther King Jr., a man who also followed God into unexpected and uncomfortable situations. Growing up in the 1980s and 1990s, in the 97.5% white Fulton, New York, trying to explain who Dr. King was and what he was fighting for was difficult for my teachers. Cultural diversity at my Roman Catholic elementary school consisted of the Vietnamese refugee family that the Sisters of St. Francis had sponsored. So the explanation we got was something like, people come in all different colors. In the South, Black people have been subjected to slavery. After the Civil War, enslaved people had been freed, but Black folks were still denied many rights. Then in the 1950s, Rosa Parks, a woman who was tired after a long day at work, had sat down at the front of a bus where Black people were not allowed to sit, and had started a movement for equal rights for people of all races. Older Black people were scared of what would happen if they stood up for themselves, but Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was a young preacher, barely out of school, and he felt called by God to lead the movement using nonviolent tactics for civil rights. He organized a march on Washington where he gave his "I Have a Dream" speech, and as a result, laws were passed that protected everyone's right to equal protection. But some white people did not like this, and one of those white people killed Dr. King. Now, there is a lot missing from this narrative. And when Rodney King was beaten in 1991, and then a year later when riots erupted in Los Angeles over the verdict, I started to have an inkling that we were not being told the whole truth. And over the years, as I learned of the death of Amadou Diallo, and then over the years, so many others, and observed not only the different way that Black people were treated by police, but also the differences in living standards between the average white family and the average Black family, I started to educate myself more and more about what was left out of the history classes growing up. But I must admit that it was not until just a little over 2 years ago that my attention really turned back to Dr. King and what we were not told about him growing up. As many of you know, when I first was called to ministry with you in June, I had not been ordained as a priest. I was still a deacon. Now, to become a deacon in the Episcopal Church on your way to the priesthood requires a Master's of Divinity degree, which is more like a JD, a law degree, in the number of credits and work required than the typical master's degree. Several years of ministerial internships, years of discernment, and passing of the General Ordination Exam, or GOE. The GOE is a 3-day-long series of 6 single essay exams, each lasting up to 3.5 hours. When I took the exam, One of the questions that was posed was in regard to Dr. King's speech and the subsequent book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community? Both of which deal with the period after the civil rights legislation was passed. A time when Dr. King's initial call had been fulfilled. The Voting Rights Act had passed. For much of white America, the civil rights era was over. King's dream of all people being judged by the content of their character and not by the color of their skin had been fulfilled. But for Blacks and for other minorities, this was a time in which there was a growing recognition that civil rights protections were not enough to guarantee equality under the law and in society. It was during this time that Dr. King spoke out against the Vietnam War, not because he condemned the actions of all soldiers for the actions of a few, but rather because Black men were overrepresented in frontline positions where they were more likely to be killed or injured, and the basis of the war was ultimately colonialism. And it was a time in which our cities were increasingly facing rioting and looting as young people gave into despair and anger over inequities. It is from this speech and book that President Obama pulled the quote that the arc of history is long, but it bends towards justice. Now, this quote seems to indicate that this bending is inevitable, but both Dr. King and President Obama recognize that it's only through the actions of individuals that this bending occurs. We shape the arc of history through our actions grounded in a faith that teaches that all of us, Black, white, Latino, Asian, and Indigenous, are made in the image of God. For Dr. King, this meant recognizing the dignity of all work and ensuring that people from all walks of life are afforded a living wage for their labor, and a second calling to lead not just the civil rights movement in this country, but also, subsequently, the Poor People's Campaign. It was this second calling, one which my teachers glossed over, which ultimately cost Dr. King his life. He was in Memphis not to lead a march for the right to the ballot box, but for sanitation workers, garbage and sewer maintenance workers, to be paid fair wages and to be provided with safer, more modern equipment. In 1968, two men, Eckel Cole and Robert Walker, had been killed when they were crushed to death in an antiquated garbage truck that they were operating. Not only that, but two other men had already been killed in 1964 by being crushed in the same way by the same type of equipment, and no changes in the equipment or operations had been made to prevent the second accident. Every day, hundreds of men working for the Memphis Sanitation Department were subjected to hazardous, unsanitary conditions without even access to showers before going home to their families, and poor wages for their labor. They were risking their lives and living in poverty to provide the city with those services most necessary for the city to exist. When they went on strike for better pay and conditions, Dr. King discerned a calling to join them. And it was in speaking to these strikers that he foretold his own demise the following day in his mountaintop speech. He did not need to be there. He could have accepted his good luck at having survived the civil rights era and retired to a life of writing and paid speaking engagements. But God called him into service to the sanitation workers. He had run his race, and yet God called him to run a second. Like with God's calls to Nathaniel and Samuel, God's call for Dr. King to lead the civil rights movement as a young preacher was unexpected. His call to lead the Poor People's Campaign and to go to Memphis to lead sanitation workers was more so. God is calling each and every one of us to come and follow him and see his image in one another. How Is God calling you to fulfill this call?